Some feminists really don't like the men's rights movement, but they don't want to admit their ideology is about hating men. What's their alternative, though? How does one reconcile one's opposition to a human rights movement that focuses on men with one's claim that one does not hate men? The same way every hate movement excuses their opposition to recognizing their target population's human rights. Make shit up. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. A prime example of anti-MRA propaganda is the rush among feminist leading media to try to associate men's issues activism with perpetrators of mass violence who have never actually been involved with any men's rights group. Their formula starts with the behavior we described last week, wherein they first label compassion for men misogynistic, then use that to consider misogyny a characteristic of men's rights advocacy. From there, it's only one more step to circle around and slap the men's rights activist or men's rights activism label on any random person or statement they consider misogynistic, regardless of whether there's any real connection to the men's rights movement or not. Then it's only a slight jump to do the same with violent behavior. When a tragedy occurs, feminist talking heads rarely even wait for the bodies of the victims to start cooling. They rush in to propagandize their deaths, naming toxic masculinity as the cause, before any information about the perpetrator is even known. Often we're told that mass murder is a male behavior attributable to the types of entertainment media that boys and men consume. If not that, we get typical feminist complaints that label men's human interest in companionship a sense of entitlement, regardless of whether or not their expression of it is respectful of interpersonal boundaries. God forbid we notice if social isolation and abuse by peers or family members contributed to a killer's descent into violent ideation, even while condemning his reaction. Never mind the fact that most men and boys confronted with such pain turn on themselves with high-risk behaviors, self-isolation, eating disorders, drug and alcohol abuse, and in the worst cases, suicide. We're just not allowed to discuss those aspects of psychological breakdowns when they happen to men, even when seeking ways to prevent those outcomes. Our detractors think if those guys just learn to play a musical instrument and cry when bad things happen to women, they'll be fine, so they don't find those abuse victims relevant or even interesting. When men's issues advocates recognize out loud that abuse can train a child to express himself through violence and use that recognition as a springboard for discussion on how to head off that violence before it happens, our opponents lose their minds. That's not a discussion that will lead to more feminist control over society. It's one that relies on compassion for men and boys as a tool of problem solving. How dare we? The result is a flood of rhetoric that sounds like the perfect set of arguments against their own battered women syndrome narrative. That narrative holds that the courts should be lenient with women who kill their partners and then claim their partner was abusive because the abuse traps the woman in a mentality that prevents her from using any other available avenue of escape. The supposition is that she has endured the abuse until she can no longer do so, and the murder, even if committed during a peaceful moment in the home, is an act of self-defense. The same people who promote that idea are appalled when it is recognized that parental abuse or neglect, bullying by peers, or other forms of abuse in a genuinely inescapable environment can contribute to the mentality behind a mass shooting, especially if the shooter had an underlying social handicap. They become outraged if anyone should dare explore anti-bullying as a preventative measure against mass violence. They really hate it if that discussion includes recognizing that girls can bully boys with profoundly damaging impact. Remember, compassion for men and boys is misogyny, especially if those men and boys are socially awkward or abused by women and girls. Suggests that explosive violence isn't a normal male behavior, but a manifestation of severe maladjustment in the face of factors that the perpetrator isn't equipped or just personally doesn't have the character to cope with, and the hate mongers will actually be offended. Suggests that such maladjustment should be addressed and therapies explored to rehabilitate the individual before their mentality leads to tragedy, and they'll accuse you of expressing sympathy for monsters.
How dare you try to analyze what happened in order to prevent future incidents instead of becoming part of the social media outrage machine? How dare your analysis include compassion for male experiences instead of condemnation for all people who have gender in common with the perpetrator? You must approve of his actions, you gun-loving masculinity apologist!
In one breath, third-wave feminist ideologues vehemently deny that the rhetoric of the architects of feminism's most prevalent narratives in any way reflects the movement's core attitudes and beliefs. In the next, they cite complaints of personal discontent or outrage within mass killers' manifestos and diatribes as evidence that they must be not just part of, but representative of the men's rights movement, and therefore are a delegitimizing factor. Their logic is stellar, because since radfems advocate for gendercide, their complaints about sexual violence make all complaints about sexual violence into advocacy for gendercide, so we can't acknowledge their existence. Similarly, if Hitler ever in his life complained about feeling too cold, anyone thereafter who heats their house to avoid feeling too cold must be a Nazi, right? What is the temperature setting on your thermostat, comrade? Critics of men's rights advocacy try to exploit the worst cases of men and boys in crisis as weapons against the reputation of a human rights movement that is actively trying to address their issues so they can be pulled back from the edge. Then those same critics claim their toxic masculinity narrative, which suggests men should do what we do, then condemns them for doing it, is the only real men's rights advocacy. After all, men, you should feel comfortable talking about your feelings, just not the feelings feminists don't like you to have, like self-interest or craving for social engagement.
Shame on you for everything, you entitled misogynistic perverts. The feminist thought police are watching you. Now why are you keeping everything so bottled up? Don't you trust women? You must be one of those women-hating men's rights activists.
Their propaganda doesn't get any more logical from there. According to our critics, none of the men's rights movement's history of analyzing law, policy, and academic study, promoting reform, supporting men and boys in crisis, or educating the public regarding the current imbalances has anything to do with who we are and what we stand for. Nope, we're totally represented by any random guy whose breakdown appears to be a result of the issues our movement exists to confront. Just ask our most vehement critics, and they'll tell you exactly that. They don't have anything else left to say.